Hi everyone and welcome to my updated GoD Demon Hunter guide. This is the best Demon Hunter build in the game by quite a mile. This is one of the best builds in the game in general. It's like the top 3 or so in the solo pushing. It is one of the best builds for solo XP farming, even group XP farming. It can do quite well right behind the Rats meta and the Bone Spear meta. So overall this is a powerhouse of a Demon Hunter build. And well, we have seen a lot of different setups, a lot of experimentation, a lot of mechanics that we found out during season 21. So I figured it would be a good time to actually make an update to this guide and basically consolidate all the info in one place here. Because there are, all these different weapon setups, especially the different breakpoints, that can get quite confusing. The great thing about this is in Season 22 especially, you get this as the free set from the Hadex gift. So Demon Hunters have the best start out of all classes pretty much. And you can just start blasting right away as soon as you get one item, which is the Quiver. And then you're basically ready to blast the higher torments already. Because this is so good and so strong. It's very fast, it's very smooth. And basically the only build you need. So let's jump into the setup here. I'm gonna mostly talk about a solo pushing variant when I explain things, and then I will also cover the speed version, the T16 version, etc. later on with the differences compared to this. But the core setup here is the Gears of Dreadland set, the GoD set that was introduced in Season 21. So the way this works is that you stack up a so-called momentum buff when you use your generators, in this case Hanging Arrow, Devouring Arrow. And you get a 200% damage buff and 160% movement speed buff. So you're going to be quite fast, and this stacks up to 5 times. So you need to attack a few times and then you can start strafing. And when you strafe, you first of all get some damage reduction, you get the mobility, and whenever a strafe projectile hits an enemy, you can spawn a lot of these hanging arrows that will destroy enemies. So the way this works is that you have the Devouring Arrow, which increases the damage done by each consecutive pierce of Hanging Arrow. And with the 9th series satchel, you have a 100% chance to pierce, on top of getting a juicy damage bonus here. This is one of the most insane single legendary items in the game. This is essentially anywhere between like a times 10 to times 50 or even times 100 damage multiplier. It's probably the single strongest item if you include, the potential of the Hanging Arrow piercing a lot of targets. But that is on the side. The other key item here is the Hunter's Wrath belt. And this one also gives you another 200% extra damage on top of the extra attack speed, which is not really that relevant because you're mostly strafing around and not really attacking manually. You only want to attack manually to actually get the buff for the momentum, and other than that, you just strafe. Another really important item here is the Dawn, which you can either wear or cube, and this gives you the Vengeance cooldown reduction. So just like pretty much any other Demon Hunter build, you want to have permanent Vengeance and you use Dawn for this. And with Vengeance, you get 40% multiplicative damage bonus and 50% damage reduction. So this is a buff that you want to keep up at all times, and it will keep you safe from crowd control effects as well. And finally, the other core item here is the Death Diggers, 100% extra damage for your primary skills again, and this counts for the Hanging Arrow. There are some supplementary items that work well with this. So first of all, the Wraps of Clarity, 50% damage reduction. So you have this anyway all the time because you want to keep up your momentum. So you want to shoot at least once every 4 seconds generally, because otherwise your momentum drops too low. And like this, you have the Wraps of Clarity buff. We have the Focus and Restraint set, and this also synergizes very well. Yet again, you don't really have to do anything. It's just naturally from playing the build the way it's supposed to. You get this buff for 2 times 50% multiplicative damage bonus. So this is really strong here. And we have typically stuff like the Flavor of Time. This can also be the Squirt's Necklace if you include the Fortress Ballista. The Fortress Ballista can keep up the shield for you, especially for speed farming. This is very nice. And it gives you a nice damage bonus for the 16, for speed GRs, for 4-man speeds. You generally wear the Squirts, and otherwise the Flavor of Time here. We have Convention. This can also be the Elusive Ring, so that kind of comes down to how well you can survive, how well your gear is optimized, and this is the more offensive choice here. So for Season 22 especially, you can include both rings. You can go Convention of Elements and Elusive Ring. This is really nice, and you don't have to decide between them anymore. So typically early on I would suggest to go just with Elusive Ring, and then later on, once you are comfortable, once your gear is better and your paragons, you can go for the Convention of Elements, and this will generally yield better results as long as you don't die all the time. In Season 22 you don't have to make that choice anymore, you can just go with both. Or you can also go with Mantle of Channeling, for example, which gives you like another small damage bonus and less of the damage reduction. So this is a bit more of a greedier choice there. But this is about it for the Season 22 variations. So you have either the rings or you have the Mantle of Channeling. And there's also the Ring of Royal Grandeur potentially that you can use to include all guilds. But this is only a speed farming variation here. Another decision that you have to make, depending on which items you actually own, is if you go with one-handed and a Quiver or with two one-handers. So typically for 4-man, because of Ice Blink and other crit bars potentially, dual wielding is slightly better, and for solo usually the Quiver is slightly better because you can roll the skill damage and it simply has pretty good stats. But it's not always possible to decide because, well, the Quiver is extremely hard to roll, so in almost every case you will have a better second weapon than having a good Quiver. And this means that you usually just cube the Quiver. But either way is totally fine, just basically go with whatever you have the best of, and if it's really close, in case you actually have really good Quiver and really good weapons, then you should either prioritize the Quiver, or you just, go check the defeat panel and see your own damage with your setup if you import your character. As for your stat rolls, you want to have cooldown reduction on the shoulders at the very least, and if you're having the Flavor of Time, then you also have it there. But in case we have a squirt setup, you need to have 2 other items instead of 1 with cooldown reduction. So when you're dual wielding, the decision is quite easy. You can just go with your weapons, so you don't really want to roll 10% damage here when you're dual wielding, because the effect is only halved, because it basically splits up between the 2 weapons. So you can just as well go with area damage and cooldown on both your weapons plus the shoulders, and you're gonna be fine. When you have the Quiver equipped, it's a bit more tricky to get it in, so you have to give up a little bit for this. Also, when you just have one weapon equipped, it's really nice to have 10% damage on it, because it's not being split up like on dual wield. So here you actually get the full value, and it's really boosting your damage here, and it's also one of the reasons why the Quiver setup is slightly better. Other than that, you want to go for the typical crit stats, crit damage, crit chance, wherever you can, and also some cold damage. And once you have achieved all of this, you go for area damage on every single slot. Area damage is really the key here. This is how you push, this is how you deal most of your damage on the higher tiers. For speed farming, you don't have to go too try hard. So for example, on the rings, you could roll the damage range here instead of area damage when you're farming. But area damage is definitely the way to go for the higher tiers. You don't really want to have any of the other stats like resource cost reduction or attack speed here. So you want to go for those only if you can, and otherwise just go for the defense wherever you can and where you need it. And make sure to roll the hanging arrow on your pants, the belt at the very least, and also the quiver if you have it. As for the legendary gems, we have the Taeguk. This one is additive, so it's actually stacking in the same way as hanging arrow, so that's one category. So that slightly decreases the roll of hanging arrow, especially for the quiver. You might run into a situation where you want to have the area damage versus the skill, and in that case you can actually choose the area damage, but also choosing the skill is fine. So basically one is a bit better for AoE situations, one is a bit better for single target situations. And the single target damage is generally quite bad on this build, so Rift Guardians are a big issue on the higher tiers when you're pushing at the very least. So you can expect something like 5, 6, even 8 minute Rift Guardian fights depending on how high you push, and it's really a drag. So basically anything that increases your single target is pretty welcome here. Your most important gem is Simplicity Strength. So this one gives you up to 100% extra damage. This is the strongest gem in the game, and on top of that you get also insane healing. So typically you will fire something like 5 to 6 hanging arrows per second. So this means you heal for something like 20 to 25% of your health every single second. This is extremely strong healing and basically covers most of your recovery, and you don't really have to go for any life per hit, any life per second. This is all the healing you'll need. And lastly, you have the Bane of the Stricken. So this is for pushing especially. In speedruns, you can definitely go with Bane of the Powerful here. You can even go Zaze. For example, when you have a really high level Zaze, that can be helpful here. and also in Tournament 16, for example, with Boon with the Hoarder and these things. So let's talk about the skill setup here. We have the Hanging Arrow, Devouring Arrow. This is pretty much the only viable rune here, and nothing really comes close to that. In T16, you could argue with something like Shatter Shot or so, because the damage doesn't really matter there, but for anything Greater Rift related, you go with this. We have the Strafe Drifting Shadow. That makes it so that you keep 100% of your normal speed, and otherwise there's not really an opportunity to take any other runes. Theoretically, you could take Rocket Storm. You give up 25% movement speed, and you get slightly more of the Strafe projectiles on single target, because the rockets that you spawn from Rocket Storm actually also proc the 4-piece. But this only happens when the cooldown is up, and it can actually proc the 4-piece. So it's a very marginal increase of something like between 2 and maybe 5% DPS or so. And you give up quite a lot of movement speed for that. So I wouldn't really recommend. The crit rune doesn't really do anything. There's a Stinging Steel that only counts for the Strafe projectiles itself, so forget about that one too. We have here the Vengeance with Dark Heart, so we don't need any of the other runes. This is just straight up a big buff here with damage and damage reduction. We have Preparation, Focus Mind with Smoke Screen Special Recipe. So you can also go with Shadow Power and Gloom. That gives you a 35% damage reduction. So this is definitely something you can go for if you're feeling that you have some trouble playing around with the Smoke Screen. But Smoke Screen is definitely the better option here once you play it well. This allows you to go a bit more squishy, like the combination of elements instead of Elusive Ring. The thing is that if you're not able to negate any attacks, you will be in trouble sometimes, even with Elusive Ring, because there will be, some really heavy hitting attacks that you want to immune and you can't. And with Smoke Screen, you have all the control and you basically can spam it on cooldown. And with a little bit of, nice timing, you can definitely survive much better than with the Shadow Power. And lastly, we have the Fan of Knives Bladed Armor. Some people also go with both Smoke Screen and Shadow Power, so you can give this up for the option to basically be even more tanky in some situations where it really matters, and then in others you're a bit more squishy. So this is kind of up to you, but just wanted to mention this here. For our passives, we have most importantly the Ambush and the Numbing Traps. So you want to have these included pretty much at all times. Numbing Traps has the nice effect that it gets procced by the Hanging Arrow itself. So this is a very strong defensive passive, and that is pretty much up at all times at pretty much everything. So this is pretty neat. Ambush is another pretty nice damage boost, especially because when you have a large pull, you can get a lot of pierces, and these will be amplified by the 40% damage bonus, and then could potentially proc like a huge every damage value that will decimate the rest of the pull. Awareness is always nice, because sometimes you might get one shot by something, or you might just have to play a bit more aggressively, have to stay in your Oculus Ring, and then you might die. So this was your safety net here. And lastly, you have Archery for another 5% crit chance. This is pretty neat. You can also go with Call the Weak. The thing is that you don't really proc Call the Weak very well. So the best way to do this is with your follower. So typically you have the Templar that has this slow effect when he gets hit or when he hits something, and you can give him a Thunder Fury and an Esso Johan. So a lot of people go with Call the Weak, and yeah, it does work, especially on single target. It works rather well, because with the Thunder Fury on the follower, you have to slow pretty much all the time. Or also like the Templar just hitting the target will slow the target. So especially when you are going for the very high tiers, Call the Weak is slightly better because of the Rift Guardian DPS. But generally, you're not really slowing very much when you're just blasting through the Rift. So Archery can be a bit of like a weaker choice, but it's much more consistent, or basically up all the time, compared to Call the Weak that only procs from your follower, and also the Esso Johan. So let's talk about Valla's Bequest here. It says that Strafe projectiles pierce, and a lot of people misunderstand this as giving you more pieces for your Hanging Arrow. But this is absolutely not the case. First of all, Hanging Arrow is not Strafe, it just gets procced by the set after using Strafe. So this doesn't really do anything, and especially this Quiver already gives you 100% chance to pierce, so there's no point in adding any more pierces. So what happens here is that the Strafe projectiles, the actual like little knives that you shoot out, they will fly through the enemies and they will be able to hit another target further in the back. And when this happens, you have a higher chance to proc another Hanging Arrow right on cooldown. The cooldown on the 4-piece bonus here is 9 frames, which is exactly 150 milliseconds. So like this, you can potentially get around 6.5 4-piece projectiles per second in the best case scenario, when you always hit exactly when the cooldown is up every 9 frames. So this is something to keep in mind. Realistic values are lower than that, so something like 6 attacks per second are really good, and even something like upwards of 5 is pretty nice. So what Valla's Bequest does is it gives you more of these 4-piece projectiles. It doesn't really increase the damage of your hanging arrow in any way, you just get more of them. This means you also get more healing from simplicity strength, and in general you just have a higher opportunity to spawn these hanging arrows in the right direction as well, because typically your strafe will fly off in all directions, but when you have a strafe projectile inside a huge pool and it hits something further in the back in that pool, your hanging arrow will also spawn towards wherever you hit the enemy. So this also has a second benefit of not just giving you more hanging arrows, but it also makes them fly in the right direction. The thing with hanging arrow is that it has a fixed travel distance, which is 120 yards. It can't go further than that. It also has maximum range away from the starting point, which is 100 yards. So what happens is that when you shoot a hanging arrow, it will always turn around every so often, and typically it will go back and forth like 2 or 3 times and then will disappear because it has used up its whole 120 yards travel distance. So if your strafe projectile hits something like far on the side of the screen, then your hanging arrow will fly to that one enemy somewhere in the corner, and it will try to pierce that one or fly to another enemy, and it will not really hit very much. Most of your damage comes from hitting and piercing a lot of enemies at a time because of this devouring arrow effect, where the damage scales up every time. This 70% damage bonus is actually a multiplier. It does multiply by 70% every time, but it basically adds 70% to that multiplier every time. So the first hanging arrow will deal 100% damage, then it's 170%, then it's 240, 310, etc. So it scales up really fast, and in some cases, in large pools, you can have easily 20 piercers pretty much constantly. And even up to 30, 40, 50 piercers is definitely doable, especially in groups. When you have a barb doing a stomp for you, you can watch everything disappear with one arrow basically. This is because all the arrow damage, it just scales to infinity. This is like one of the best group scaling or like arrow damage scaling builds in the game because of this mechanic. So now that you know how Valla's Bequest works, you have to take a look at the breakpoints, and they are quite relevant for your DPS. The thing is that, as I mentioned, you have a 9-frame cooldown on the 4-piece projectiles. And the typical breakpoint you're going to be for strafe is going to be 7 frames. This means that when you spawn a strafe projectile at frame 0, it hits an enemy, you will spawn a 4-piece projectile, and then at frame 9 you will be able to spawn the next one. But at frame 7 you're already shooting the second strafe projectile. This means that this strafe projectile will hit an enemy and will not spawn anything because the cooldown is not up yet. So the next strafe projectile will be at frame 14. And you see that there's quite a significant gap of 5 frames between when the cooldown is ready and when you shoot again. And this is exactly where Valla's Bequest comes in. It makes it so that in the large pools, these strafe projectiles keep flying and they keep proccing the GoD 4-piece bonus further back in the pool. So effectively, Valla's Bequest, depending on the density, depending on how many enemies are there, you get around 0 to 25% or so extra DPS from single target ranging to the best case scenario with a large pool. So overall, you get maybe something like a 15% bonus, 20% bonus quite easily here whenever you have a little bit of density, maybe like 10, 15 targets or so around you, and then like a little bit stacked up. So this is kind of like what you have to keep in mind here for Valla's Bequest. Theoretically, you can roll some attack speed here that would help you out a bit, and with a Quiver for pushing very high tiers, this could actually be okay to roll one item with attack speed, because that will put you from the 7 frames to the 6 frames breakpoint. This again doesn't really do much during the Rift, but it will help you out on a Rift Guardian. So when you're pushing extremely high, the Rift Guardian fights get very long, and one extra attack speed also gives you a bit more stricken. It gives you a bit more projectiles on the boss, and that could probably cut down the boss time by even like half a minute or so on like the 5-minute fight. But to sum this up, you shouldn't really care too much about your attack speed. Basically, try to avoid attack speed wherever you can. You don't want this, it's not a really desirable stat. And even if you have this quiver set up and don't go for it, it's totally fine. You just need to know that Valla's Bequest gives you more of these hanging arrows when you're strafing, and that it scales up the more targets you have up to a certain point, because it also caps out at the 9 frames cooldown. Let's talk a little bit about some different variations here. It is possible to change your weapons to something else. For example, the Odyssey's End, you can also go with Yang's V-Curve theoretically. So here's the advantage of the bows. You can get the 9 frame breakpoint from strafe naturally without the Valla shenanigans. So what you have to do for this is you need to have a maximum 19% attack speed quiver, and then you need to remove your Paragon's attack speed. And like this, you will stay exactly at the breakpoint where you keep the 9 frames. If you go higher than that, you will be at 8 frames, and that will be basically the worst case scenario, because then you have a 4-piece GoD projectile only every 16 frames, and this is a significant DPS downgrade. So make sure you don't go over this breakpoint. It's 19% attack speed maximum that you can have. But like this, you are able to run a bow, and either you go Odyssey's End. This is a rather difficult playstyle, so I wouldn't recommend this for beginners, but it's definitely pretty nice. You can basically stack up the entangling shot effect with the heavy burden rune here, so you strafe around before your convention cycle, get the Odyssey's End buff on everything, and then you switch to a hanging arrow. Basically you swap back and forth between the 2 different generators, and like this you can do massive bursts, and it also greatly increases your single target damage. In case you get a really good Yang's V-Curve, you can also try that one. So the setup here looks like this. You have Captain Crimson with a Ring of Aura Grandeur. So you give up the Elusive Ring, we give up the Convention of Elements actually, to cube the Hunter's Wrath. And like this you can include the Captain Crimson set, and you get the big damage reduction from the extra resource cost from the Yang's V-Curve. So this is actually a fairly tanky build, because like this you can also use the Shadow Power and the Smoke Screen pretty much permanently because of all this resource cost reduction that you're gonna have. And on top of that, you can roll slightly more air damage because you don't need any cooldown on your items. So you can go full air damage everywhere. You can roll something like resource on your shoulders, for example. And again, you want to have this 19 attack speed here if you want to go for this setup. But this is season 22 only. For speed variations, you have something like this here. So you can go with the Fortress Ballista and the Squirts, as I mentioned earlier. And you don't really need the Vallas here. You don't really make large pulls. Generally just want to blast through the rift in like 2 minutes maybe, or 2.5. So you don't really get much value from the Vallas. Instead you have the extra damage from the Squirt. That is pretty neat. Fortress Ballista will protect your Squirts. Just make sure that you kind of learn how to feel out the shield, so that you know what you can take and what you have to avoid. And then you can optimize your speedruns like this. Another option is also here to drop the Elusive Ring. So this is a very squishy setup for speed farming, but it's theoretically the best setup once you optimize this and once you play well enough and never die. So you have to be quite careful with your Squirts, and you might drop it sometimes, but as long as you don't die, you are fine. So you can have the Orgulls here for extra damage, extra elite damage. You get back a little bit of damage reduction, but you give up the Elusive Ring and the Wrath of Clarity. So overall, it's a net loss in toughness, but quite a decent gain in DPS. And like this, you can just zoom through like 105s at least, 110s even over 110 once you have a little bit of Paragons and some Augments. For the 16 Rifts, it looks something like this. So we have Yang's V-Curve yet again for the resource cost reduction. This helps you out immensely. You can just like use all your skills as much as you like. You can spam your Smoke Screen, you can spam your Shadow Glide, you can rush around, and then you include the typical T16 items like Everrise Band, Boon of the Hoarder, and maybe something like a Storm Jordan. You could keep the Convention of Elements, but it doesn't really matter. The damage is very high on this build in T16. You don't really have to worry. It's essentially just about stacking mobility, stacking some resource like Blood Vengeance and Tactical Advantage, and then you just blast your way through. Bounties looks quite similar, so you have something like Elusive Ring instead of the Boon of the Hoarder. You can also go with Convention here, and even more mobility, for example, with something like Hot Pursuit, Crown's Belt, and you can go back with something like Wrath of Clarity. You don't need Nemesis Braces, and just blast your way through. The Elusive Ring, you are quite tanky, but it helps you to just TP out from bounties where there might be some enemies left that will hit you, and you can just go next bounty, and this is like one of the best bounty farmers in the game. And now finally to the gameplay. The basics are actually quite simple. What you want to do is you keep up Vengeance at all times, you keep up the Fan of Nice bladed armor at all times if you have it, and you can pretty much keep up the preparation, focus mind at all times or on cooldown to refill your discipline. So this is something that you basically want to press whenever it's ready, and you do have to stack up your momentum to 20 right at the start, and then you want to keep it at 17 or above. So the way you do this, you shoot 5 times if you're hanging arrow somewhere in the corner even. You don't have to hit an enemy, and this will give you the stacking damage buff. You can see it on your skill bar or on your buff bar. The problem is that the momentum has a bug, and it doesn't always apply a new momentum stack when you attack. So it can happen that you strafe and interrupt your strafing for the hanging arrow, and you shoot, and you don't get any momentum. And you have to pay some attention to your momentum stacks, or you have to pay attention to how you slow down with your character, because as your momentum drops, your movement speed also goes down rapidly. So you will notice it with a little bit of practice, but it's always better to keep an eye on the skill and see if it actually refreshes if you can. Other than that, when your momentum is high, you can just strafe around, and you will shoot at enemies around you automatically whenever they get hit by strafe. And you can weave in the generators in your strafing, so you don't really have to stand still and shoot hanging arrows, but instead you do it both at the same time pretty much without really losing much time for strafing. So the way you do this, you hold down strafe, and then you force stand still or force attack with your hanging arrow. So in my case, I have it on shift, a hotkey, and I hold down shift and I press my left mouse button for hanging arrow while I'm holding down strafe. Then try to make large pulls, especially when you're pushing. Your arrow damage is key, your pierces are key, so you scale up in 2 ways. So use that to your advantage, and make sure that you don't waste time on like little small enemies in the corner, or even the big enemies that are almost dead. Your damage drops rapidly when you have fewer targets or only one target, and your single target damage is horrible. So this is something to keep in mind. Even on speed farming tiers, the Rift Guardian can feel quite slow compared to everything else, simply because it's alone and you don't really get the extra pierces, and on a single target you get maybe like 2, 3, maybe 4 pierces maximum, while in a AoE situation it can be much more, like up to 10 times of that. Like this, it's quite important to always stay near the enemies, somewhere in the center or close to the pole, so you can kite enemies towards you. Also, you need to keep a special eye on your follower. The Templar or the enchanters or whatever you're using is going to be the key here. You want to make pulls around the follower because of SSO and procs. Whenever SSO and procs, enemies are quite tightly stacked, and you will basically destroy the pull quite quickly, even without conventional rotations. So your damage skyrockets and you can feel it. So make sure that you play around your follower properly, force the PM around if you need to, but you want to make large pulls whenever possible, and then try to stay in the Oculus rings when you spawn one, and try to stay close to the enemies in most cases, because that will maximize the arrow time inside the pool and will give you more pierces and more DPS. This is especially important when you're playing one of the bow versions, because essentially you have this exact 9 frames breakpoint for the bow versions, and this means that your strafe projectile should immediately hit an enemy. So you basically want to be inside the pool, much more than you want with the Valla's Bequest, for example. With the typical setups, you want to go a little bit to the side of the pool. You basically want to shoot at it from one side, but with bows, you want to be inside the pool, so that your strafe projectile always immediately hits something, to always have the perfect 9 frame spawn. One neat little detail that you should know is that missile dampening packs are very good for this. So when you find missile dampening, it makes it so that your hanging arrow slows down, and because it's limited by the travel distance and not by time or by amount of pierces, it can essentially infinitely pierce until minutes later it might fly out. So whenever you find missile dampening, you'll basically destroy everything that's inside within seconds. Even on tier 150 you can do damage even when your character is not optimized, because essentially you get like a ×10 or ×20 damage multiplier from missile dampening. You can just shoot arrows into it, and eventually the enemies will melt in there, because the arrows just keep going back and forth basically inside of them and just stack to infinity. So that's about it for the guide and the gameplay. So just in short, to summarize, you want to keep up your buffs like the Vengeance, like the Preparation. You want to use Smokescreen or Shadow Power to survive, and then keep up the momentum to at least 17 or more, and otherwise just strafe around, try to stack up enemies when you're in the slower runs, or just blast through really quickly and ignore the little like single enemies somewhere in a corner. Well, I know this has been a lot of information. It is a very complicated build with a lot of mechanics, but the gameplay is overall quite simple. So you just need to understand the basic concepts of, why the attack speed matters, why the breakpoints matter, how you actually stack up momentum, how you use your strafe, and then you'll be fine. But if you want to read up on this, we have a written guide of this on Maxroll. So here are all the details yet again explained with everything you need to know about the setup, about the skills, the gems, the items, and all the different variations, everything you want basically. So this is something that you can read up on. The link is in the description. So I hope this helps you to build your own Demon Hunter. Wish you good luck in the season. I'll see you guys next time.